So I want to just introduce our panelists. My first guest is Efi Avigdor. Efi is the founder of Wealth Dialogue and is a family office advisor and wealth owner advocate. I love those descriptions, Efi. Prior to founding her own firm, she spent over 20 years serving the ultra high net worth and serving family offices at Anderson Tax in New York City, where she served as the managing director and led the family office team globally. So welcome, Efi.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate you having me today, and I'm excited for what we're going to talk about.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Tim Lappen. Tim is the founder and chairman of the family office group at the law firm Jeffer, Mangels, Butler, and Mitchell in Los Angeles. He's especially effective in his work with family-owned and closely held businesses. He's a founding director of UCLA Anderson School's Steinbeck Family Business Program, and also one of the directors of the USC Marshall School of Business Family Business Program. I'm glad to see, Tim, that you've seen the light and that you've come to Drucker. Welcome, yes. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I appreciate you asking me, Dave, and to be on this illustrious panel with Efi and Ken. Ken, with whom I've worked for probably 30 some years now. It's a real treat, and to see so many familiar faces in the gallery. I won't call you out because you may not want to be recognized in that way, but I'm delighted you're here because one of my goals in life is to amortize all the time I spent learning something across a lot of people. So thank you for including me.
We're going to try to do that today, Tim. And my last guest is Ken Kilroy. Ken is Senior Director in the Private Client Services Family Office West region of RSM, the fifth largest accounting firm in the United States. Ken has held senior family office roles for more than 30 years. Ken's 30 plus years in family office direct investing experience includes 20th Century Fox, Davis Petroleum, Davis Entertainment, the Sports Club, on and on and on. Ken, you can tell us about some of those adventures along the way, but Ken, thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So I want to begin with a question for Tim. Tim, as we think about family offices, how they start, how they evolve, and how they serve wealth holding families, what are typical reasons families consider developing a family office?
If I may, I'll start with a truism that has probably been heard by many people in this conference, which is you met one family office, you've met one family office. So the only thing they have in common is they call themselves a family office, and it's a self-declared name. It's not like you have to qualify. When I started this work in the 80s, it was a lot easier. People said, if you're worth 200 million or more, you could have a family office. But the reality is, people start it for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's sort of the unintentional creation. They had a family business, they sell it, and they don't have the structure to take care of their personal expenses. They need it because they have more to do than they have time for. Hopefully they also realize that making money and managing money are phenomenally different issues. So when they create a family office, hopefully they get input from people like us on the panel today as to what you need, because there's no one model. It really is a bespoke situation. So do you want to have your own people that you can tell, pick up this and drop that? Do you want your own people so there's much more confidentiality involved? Do you want your own people because it's too hard to find, like you're doing a lot of private equity, and you need to have somebody who can source deals and run deals and be on the board and report directly back to you? So there's so many issues that come up in those conversations. It's a really good first meeting for people considering either starting or reforming a family office as to, well, are you creating a legacy office that you want to have manage money for many generations? Are you creating a philanthropic office, first of which was really done by John D. Rockefeller? They had so much money, he had to institutionalize giving it away. So it really, there is no one thing, but it's not unusual to have a family business at the beginning of this, and either it's sold or people realize it's probably a good idea to separate the personal expenses and wealth from the people who are working in the core business.
Tim, just a follow-up question on that. As we think about this life cycle of the family office, how frequently are these offices actually evolving? Because the purpose for which they're created almost is never the purpose for which it still exists,
Sure.
10 years later or 20 years later.
Right.
How do you see families kind of checking in on their purpose for organizing a family office, and how systematic is that?
I'd like to draw an analogy between a family office structure, a person's estate plan, and going to the gym. Some people go to the gym the first part of January and then think that was great, and you don't come back. It's not really a good lifetime structure, is it? I mean, no one stays fit with coming once in a while. So it's an organic situation. And with like the estate plan, we do a plan for a family and they've got kids who are 3, 5, and 7. And you say, are they good with money? Well, who do you know? They're little kids, right? They haven't lost any nickels that you gave them for their allowance. But so you really need to modify and adjust and stay mobile. I would say when families of great wealth, great meaning $1 billion and higher, then you're dealing with a different situation. You're not dealing with this amount of money that's likely to be spent in any 1 or 2 generations. That's almost certainly going to be a legacy office. And so they will be planning about how to bring the grandchildren in to the philanthropic aspect, something I know Ken's very interested in. If it's someone who, quote, only has 50 million or 100 million, they could still call themselves a family office. But if that family's got 3, 4, 5 kids, the odds are the next generation will not have incredible wealth, and they won't really need to necessarily have that plan. But just to make a quick example of that, we had a family that was about $1 billion family for which I did a 100-year estate plan. And is it going to be changed over time? It has already been changed over time, but you need to have a vision as to what you're trying to accomplish. And in their case, they wanted to be sure that any of their followers in the family had medical care. So they had a pot trust for that. They had a pot trust for education. They had a pot trust. One of the core values was to live near the family. So anyone who wanted to live in the county could get money from the family bank. So it's, again, it requires thoughtful guidance, which is, I mean, that's certainly Efi's focus, is thoughtful guidance. Knowing what the options are is a huge benefit, because clients will frequently come up with the option they choose being of the options that they're aware of. And if they don't know that there are some other options that work extremely well, sometimes they might even decide to go a completely different route and not use family members to be the family office executives and have a professional company, many of which you probably know have segued into being trust companies. Some of the biggest trust companies around started as family wealth managers.
Yeah, exactly. And I think at the beginning of every family office, that family office begins with very little familyness in it. It's a founder that is saying, this is a structure that I need to be able to manage my affairs, and maybe my affairs on behalf of those that I care about and those that I love. But at some point it becomes a family office when that office serves the family unit, which I don't know if it's always in the first generation. But Efi, I wanted to turn to you to kind of to have you kind of humanize this thing that is the family office. As you think about the different elements that are possible in a family office, I'm going to ask you a tough one here. What are the most common non-financial reasons people start and continue to operate a family office? So what are the most important or top non-financial reasons people start or operate family offices?
Well, I'll say that family offices are really a framework to professionalize the wealth process, to take it an institutional mindset around various wealth functions. So, they really allow for more mindful practice and organization around the family's key service needs and their outside service providers. So, they allow for stronger risk mitigation, which is sometimes overlooked. Actions become more accountable, less haphazard, less likely that stuff falls through the cracks. They're a way to streamline and centralize basic concierge services for the family, like travel and banking needs, and create some economies of scale. And they allow for governance practices and education to be developed, which can't be underestimated in terms of being a focus area for wealthy families. A family office is really a springboard for conversation in these areas, for family boards, family constitution, family meetings. It's really that springboard. And many family offices, are basically acting as investment companies. And if you think about any high functioning company, it has to have the C-suite, all of the management, the various departments that have to coalesce and come together in a very deliberate and effective way. And that's what a family office makes happen. So by its very nature and structure, it has a lot of core functions outside of just the financial arena.
So Efi, in talking about governance and education, you talked about how important that is. How often are you seeing families actually budget for that element of really investing in the human beings and their, I guess, growth and development? I mean, there is a budget to manage real estate. There is a budget to manage, privately held assets and publicly held assets. And that just seems normal. But how normal is it for a family to actually budget to invest in the human capital that is served or is supposed to be served by the family office?
It's pretty rare, actually, but I will say there's a growing industry around that, right? More, specialists in the governance area trying to help families become aware of that. Programs like, your own in the academic space to try to help, family offices recognize that it's not just these financial metrics. If you can have great investment management, you could have great tax efficiency in a family office, but if you're not sort of allowing and manning for these other governance and education aspects, the family is sort of doomed to fail, right? So it's super important. And I'll say, there's now, like Tim was describing, trusts that really allocate funds just for that purpose, so that when you get generations later, that it's not sort of squandered on these other things, and the focus is not being spent on putting the money to work for effective governance, for effective education, and I don't mean, education like go to college. It's education around the family wealth, the family business, the family mission, what's important to this family. How can we keep the glue among us, sticky?
So when you talk about building a family office, oftentimes it's around investments, it's around tax planning. As you've worked with so many families and they decide what to bring in-house and what to outsource, can you talk about maybe how they decide on that and what is typically outsourced? I mean, there is probably no typical, again, because family offices are so different and their resources are wildly different. But I guess if there are typical things that are outsourced, what are those? And maybe if you could describe some of those services.
Yeah, well, my personal opinion, and I don't know if all will agree, but I personally think tax should be outsourced. I think, any kind of tax planning, tax compliance, tax efficiency structuring, I think that is such a complex area, and it's hard to have in-house expertise, within a family office. It's constantly changing. There's legislation. So I think in areas, in complex areas like that, also in some forms of investment management and asset allocation and things like that, there may be a lot of expertise in-house, again, in the investment space, but not across all asset classes and all managers and all, again, in the areas where it's hard to keep up and where there's a lot of technical complexity. I think you really have to look outside the family office oftentimes. But I'll say really culture is the most important. So within your family office, especially in the early stages, if you have few key employees that can wear many hats and have, different strengths, allow them to use their strengths and look outside for, what you don't have in-house. So you have to be a little bit flexible.
Tim, what would you add to that? in terms of outsourcing and how to, what to build inside and what to outsource?
It's a great question. And to build on what Efi said, to a great extent, we come into offices many times that have internal attorneys, especially if the family, say, is a real estate family. They may have a real estate attorney involved, or if they're doing a lot of work with securities, they might even have an SEC lawyer involved. But frequently they need bolstering, and also the financial aspects. I say it's sort of the difference between paying retail when you need it versus wholesale 24/7. But I think Efi's point is an excellent one. The day a professional goes in-house at one family office is sort of the end of the cross-pollination that can be so valuable for a professional to have 20 family offices and know all these different things that are going on and be dealing with issues that come up for one that really benefit others to know about, not without confidentiality issues, but just in terms of when the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act became more prevalent among family offices, people weren't paying attention to that before. They never really thought about having an active ownership of a company with overseas operations. So we'll keep saying this probably throughout this whole presentation. It depends, which is a horrible thing for a lawyer to say, because it sounds like, can't you just give me the answer? Well, there really isn't the answer. It really does depend upon what's going on. But economically, it can be very valuable to have outside resources, especially for bandwidth. Because if you have one or two people in the office who are doing one or two things, and all of a sudden something big comes up, you don't have the bench to be able to help with that. So that's another way it can be helpful.
So maybe this one's for Ken then. Are we building family offices backwards? I mean, it feels like oftentimes we lead with technical expertise, we lead with a certain asset class that we like, and we bring that professional inside. But what I'm seeing most is that the human side, dealing with preparing heirs, dealing with governance, oftentimes that is what's outsourced, and it gets, 2 to 4 days a year. This may feel like a loaded question because I'm so passionate about the human side, but Ken, are we doing it backwards, or challenge me on that?
Well, I don't think so. I think it depends, as many things do, on what the facts are. And if you sold the family business, a lot of times people will turn to somebody like Efi when they've said, "Hey, we think we're going to sell our family business," and she's not going to sell the family business, but she can help prepare them. And a lot of times, when people get a lot of cash, they think, "Oh, well, now I need a family office." They probably needed the family office when they had the $1 billion, closely held company. They didn't need to sell it, but a lot of the services they rely on are embedded in that business. So you find the CFO, because interestingly, people do whatever the billionaire tells them to do. So, and they're happy to incorporate that into their position in whatever operating business they're in. But once they sell that operating business, a lot of the underpinning of that family is gone, and they need something. And I think when we were talking about generalists versus somebody that has a certain expertise, sometimes you need generalists in areas of expertise. So like you need I used to use lawyers. I think I used more than 120 law firms, but I had, Tim, 35 years ago, I hired Tim to be sort of the generalist from the outside to deal with, communications lawyers or television stations or oil and gas or entertainment lawyers. But a lot of times you don't know, if you just, as we all say, you don't know what you don't know. It is very helpful to have generalists. So generalists in the tax field, so the patriarch doesn't go to prison for failing to pay sales tax on an $80 million painting that he had shipped to California. And you know, a lot of the things that make the headlines are usually just because of issue recognition and or having to rely on the wrong people without any expertise.
I want to go back to this concept, the life cycle of the family office. And Ken, you brought it up. Oftentimes families begin with an embedded family office, which is embedded in a family business. When that family business sells, then they either are looking to begin a single family office, which is only focused on them. They may join a multifamily office. They may set up a virtual family office. So there's so many different ways that families are served. Anything in particular about the different types of family offices and why people might consider one as better for their family than another? And that's just open for anyone, I guess, on the panel. Okay, I'll give it to Efi.
You put me on the spot. You know, I think there's no one right answer to that question. Obviously, you know, depending on the situation of the family and at what's, you know, how many generations, you know, what was the family business, how equipped are the family members, is there an active family member pool from which to draw where they can actually serve the family. So there's so many sort of possibilities to go with the question in terms of, you know, can you build it in-house? Can you do a hybrid? Should you outsource it all? I mean, again, I go back to there's so many very strong competencies outside the family office. Sometimes it's very hard to build internally. It takes scale, it takes time, you know, it takes resources. And so, you know, do you want to devote internally to building that? So I think it really varies. I think it depends, again, on what stage of the life cycle the family office is really in, and also it changes over time. I've seen, you know, often where a family, you know, they start to build from the ground up, they get going, and then, you know, families become more disparate. You know, they go all over the world. They, you know, culturally, ideology may change. You know, the portfolio changes, and then maybe they're not as equipped internally. Again, so many things can happen that you really have to kind of look at it at each stage and decide what might be right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Efi. Go ahead, Tim.
Add on to that, you know, that I think when it comes to family offices, what they're all looking for is competence, but chemistry is one of the most important components. And it depends a lot upon the structure they're dealing with. Some of the family offices we deal with are really hedge funds, and they're structured in a very organized way because they have a very laser-like focus on what they're trying to accomplish. And there are others that really have an attitude that, you know, I want to start a business or have a business and I want to bring my kids along and have them be part of it. So I make the joke about if I were a recruiter and I said I was going to help staff your family office and I'm going to look the entire world to find the best person. And they say, well, maybe I'll just look in the Western Hemisphere. Well, maybe I'll just look on the Western, you know, I'm going to look in your house and find the best person to run it. You know, you probably would fire me because it's a little small sampling to be looking for. But if your goal is to have a family run business, then maybe you're not concerned about alpha. You're looking really for a collegial environment. Another way you can build that in is when the kids get older, people have an interest in various businesses. And if they want out, you can't keep them in forever, but if they want out, you may have to take a haircut. So you kind of have an enforced stay in requirement to keep them all together. But I'm reminded of a few years ago when talking with the Pritzker family about the three of this generation were involved with political campaigns. And one was working for McCain, one was for Obama, and one was for Clinton. So try to manage money for people with really disparate interests. And
it's like asset allocation, isn't it, Tim? Is that asset allocation across?
It can be, yeah. But it's also very interesting to look at what is it. I mean, it's not like a right or wrong. It's a philosophical thing. And in many families, you'll find there's an offspring who can't spend the interest that's being distributed. And then there's another kid who's sold his birthright, you know, on eBay. So you've got all kinds of variables here that to say that what's the best format for them. them as completely fluid. So you have a lot to figure out how to best serve those people and what their interests are.
Yeah. You bring up a point. Oh, go ahead, Efi.
I was just going to add to that, Dave, and say, you really get what you pay for. And sometimes families especially are hesitant to outsource certain functions when, they have a family member eager and ready to serve, right? So you really get what you pay for. And especially in families like this, where there's so much complexity, sometimes you should look outside the family. But also even when you have sometimes those hard conversations with family members, like, do we need to spend more resources building up this family member to serve in a certain role? And are we doing that? So again, some of those conversations.
All right. We have a question from the audience. Jay Hughes, if you want to take yourself off mute, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, it's wonderful to meet all of you and to hear what your careers have been. And I'm very impressed in the right sense of hearing the wisdom that's being shared. I had mentioned to Dave the other day when he said he was going to do this, that I would perhaps jump in with this thought. Some of my colleagues and I, and very much including you, I think, in this conversation, have been trying to figure out if there was a way to use words in this thing, family office, to use words in a slightly different way than I've heard. So it's not different, but just slightly different. Because of the question for the rising generation members, to try to understand what it is and what is their right relationship. And so we've been playing with the idea of saying, well, aren't these really founder offices, as we have been mostly discussing them? And then there's a second stage that I've seen in every single one of them that hasn't been mentioned. That's the reason, but mentioned. Don't they become the office of the trustees after the founder is gone? Or maybe even during his or her lifetime. But because 90%, as we all know, wealth and financial capital, I'm not speaking of wealth in any other context, because wealth to me means well-being. As you know, that's what the word means, doesn't mean money. Financial capital means money, wealth means well-being. So looking only for the moment at financial capital, what we're seeing almost every single time in the common law world is that the fortune, the financial capital, moves from the founder to the office of the trustees. But the office of the trustees isn't identified. But really, really important, because here's this rising generation member trying to figure out, what is my relationship to this thing? It says family in it, but I'm an appendage. I'm actually not a client. I might be an appendage in a limited partnership. I might be an appendage in a trust. I'm an appendage. I know that, but the office doesn't talk to me that way, or the word family seems to include me, but it doesn't. And then, so the question we're asking is this: is it really in the evolution process, so we get the words right, a founder's office, maybe his or her spouse, that's an open question. Is it then the office of the trustees? Because all the financial capital is going to end up in trust. 90% of all these families by the third generation, the wealth's in trust. So is it then the office of the trustees? And then does it become a family office only when one rising generation member voluntarily asks to become a client? And the reason that we're doing that is what we see in the personnel of the offices are almost entirely, and as you've been defining them, quantitative people. It doesn't mean they don't have a qualitative aspect to them, but they're basically quantitative. They're working to deal with a fortune in financial capital in some remediation process. Because what we see is them leaving the office just before the rising generation might become voluntary clients. Because the rising generation asks very, very different questions, just as you've all been expressing. So what we're trying to do is to say, is family office essentially the wrong term for the first two lives of that being? Would it be better for communication and understanding if it was the founder's office, then the office of the trustees, and still the founder's office? And then maybe it becomes a family office. And the only reason I'm jumping in on this is I said, Dave, I might, if it helped us all, is that I'm dealing with endless conversations with rising generation members who don't understand their relationship to this. Because they say, I'm not a client of this. Somebody calls me a client, but I'm not. I'm an appendage. They don't use that word, but that's a fact. Because they recognize that their interests are not as a client's interests. So if we were lawyers or accountants, as we are, or bankers, we say, well, who's my client? So the question really is, are the rising generation members clients of that office, although they're called that, or are they really appendages until there's some voluntary relationship?
Thank you, Jay. I would love to ask the panelists just to react to that. And maybe the question is, how do we actively make these offices, whatever we want to call the office, how do we encourage them to actually become family offices? Any Ken, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think, and Jay, it's nice to see you. I've read plenty of stuff that you've written over the years, and it's I think that it's like everything else in the family office world. It depends, and oftentimes it depends on the talent of the people, but also on a lot of times you see a patriarch pass away, and they own large companies, a number of large companies, and you might have one a child or a grandson running a very, very large company, making billion-dollar decisions, and yet his sister just remembers him as the annoying 13-year-old he used to be.
Right.
And I think that, because we've got to remember, these are families, and those kind of things, don't come to mind in large corporate environments where, there's shareholders and it's institutional investment. But many times all that counts is those relationships between the siblings when someone does pass away. But for the most part, I think the patriarch of the family, the matriarch of the family, whoever's in control, sets those parameters in documents with lawyers like Tim, and people have to live with it for a while until they can't live with it, and that's why there's plenty of litigation in the family office world.
Tim, what else would you add?
Yeah, I think, Jay, good to see you. And I like the question. Pardon me. And I don't think you need me to say it depends again, because we've said that 7 times already in this program. But you really do, it really does depend upon the family dynamic. You see it in the estate plan where a family will say, then the kids will decide, blah, blah, blah. And they say, well, how do they get along? They don't get along. But they're going to decide. It's like saying the couple has a prenup that says, and if they get divorced, they'll decide on blah, blah, blah. They're not going to decide. They're getting divorced. These kids have never worked together. It's exacerbated when you've got 1 or 2 kids in the business who think they know what they're doing, and 2 or 3 kids outside the business who don't think the kids in the business deserve what they're getting. They're getting the same dividend, but the kids in the business have got expense accounts and income. So you have these underlying animosities that it's going to destine to fail the family office if they're going to be, the younger brother is going to be in charge of everybody. So the family dynamic's hugely important as to where that goes. But I've seen a number of families where there is sort of an alpha child who comes along, and it's the son or the daughter. It's usually just one, and the others recognize, because to me, it almost goes back to parenting, because the parents didn't pit them against each other. The kids are more collaborative, and so it can work beautifully in some cases. The other challenge, though, is that whoever is running the office becomes a target, and there's a downturn. We've seen that all, and when the market goes soft, the person who's been running the office, thanklessly, hasn't been paid enough really to take the risk that he or she is taking, then becomes a target from the siblings who say, why didn't she diversify, or why didn't she do this or that? And they're going to get Monday morning quarterbacked. So it really just depends. And for some families, we'll recommend that they use an outside group to do, or hire people inside to run the office, because there's really nobody, and maybe it's not that they're incompetent kids, maybe they just don't have an interest. Clearly, any of us who have a kid who's an artist wouldn't want to say, well, drop your art career and get an MBA and go to work in the family business. That's not really the point. So it's also, there's so many variables here. It makes a program like this very difficult. But the idea here is to spread out some of this knowledge to give you things to think about, not that you'll have the answer, because there really isn't an answer for almost any of these questions, but it's a decision tree that you have to go down by saying, oh, well, based on this, how would that work? How do your kids get along? Do you think your son is inclusive, or will your daughter feel marginalized, or vice versa?
For me, Tim, one of the important questions that each family should continually ask is this being done for someone, or is this being done to them? And if they're not included, if their voice isn't at the table, if they don't have an opportunity to provide insight, it will inevitably feel like something is being done to them, and it won't work for their good.
Well, mission statements were real popular for a while, and we'd talk to families, and then they'd have a retreat somewhere, and the patriarch would, over breakfast, hand out the mission. There was no discussion among any of the people about what they were trying to accomplish. This is the mission. And look, I'll disclose that my own father was a prominent attorney. And one day he asked me about his estate plan. Obviously, I didn't do his estate plan. And he had some ideas about what he wanted to do. And I said, have you discussed those with my two sisters and my brother? And he said he hadn't. And I said, well, I can't advise you for obvious reasons, but I would suggest, like with any client, you need to talk to the people who are going to be tasked with implementing or living into the structure that you're building to see if that's what they want, because they may not, and we all think we know, but we don't. And I think it's important to take a real world look at not the situation where in the perfect world this would be what it's like. It's almost like when you hire a family office executive. If you go on with a traditional employment search company and you put a list of tasks down, you could come back with Dwayne Johnson or Mary Poppins, right? Because they meet the same task. They both can be really good with children and fun and this and that, but there's a very different thing between them. So there's the chemistry aspect of and it wouldn't be the first time that one of us has had a family office who does a 10-page list of what the job description looks like, and then hire someone who doesn't meet any of the criteria because they like the chemistry and they think that person would be a good addition.
Yeah. Jay, I appreciate the question. I think we do need to spend more time. I think naming things properly is part of the solution. So it's worth more of our collective work. Thank you.
Dave, thank you. And thank you again for bringing this to light. I'm not pounding a hammer, but I do think that the question of whether the office evolves to the office of the trustees is a critical question that has not been well understood in our field. The trusts are living beings. They're human relationships. I'm not getting into the law of this, but trusts are human relationships. That the law requires that, and then there are rules around them. But I think if the office isn't seen in that second stage, then you get all kinds of misunderstanding of the actual relationship to the financial capital, because nobody owns it for 80 or 90 years. I've been dealing, Dave, with some family offices that have existed now since the 1920s, and they've been principally administering the trust vintages of 33 and 31 and 35. And 47. And they're suddenly finding themselves with those families 80 and 90 years, not one person's ever owned anything. So if you look ahead for the moment, beyond the founder and the business and the liquidity, you look ahead to the actual work of the office, which is, in these cases, has been 100 years now. They're suddenly discovering that they don't know who they're investing for, as an example.
Yeah.
Are they investing for trusts, which they've been doing now since 1931? Or are they investing for people that are going to own something when no one's owned anything for 80 years?
Mm-hmm.
So there are a series of questions in the offices that when one looks at the actual life of an office in the context that we're talking about, so founder office, then office of the trustees, that's the actual reality of the office for most of its life is actually going to be an office of the trustees. I'm not hammering this, but I think the field hasn't actually fully understood that the first transition of the financial capital isn't to people, it's to trusts.
Correct.
And
I agree.
then the life of those trusts are actually going to be the longest lived family members in the way the trusts are written.
I agree.
So there's a stage, and then you kind of get to the question, well, what happens to the actual rising generation members because they don't have scripts from the office, and the office doesn't have scripts, CSRIPTS, for how to be a limited partner or how to be a beneficiary.
Yeah, that's a great topic, Jay. I think we'll need to move on to the rest of our agenda. But
Amen.
I would say that I think what I wrote an article called "What's a Trustee and Do I Want to Be One?" Because I find that beneficiaries think of trustee as the person you call if you need money. It's like a personal banker, and have no concept at all of what the rules are. So, but thank you for highlighting that. Dave, you want to?
Thank you again, Jay. Yes, we do have a question coming in from the chat from Lynn. Lynn Knox. Lynn is asking, can you address how multi-generational trust impact the family office and family dynamics? Maybe we've talked about some of that already. I don't know if any of you want to take that on.
I'm not sure I understand the question. You're saying the trust will determine where the money goes, so the family office doesn't have any more discretion than the trust would allow. But I'm not sure I understand. They're talking about the interplay between them, because the family office is just sort of the implementer of what the family plan is.
And let's see if Lynn is willing to come on and kind of clarify that question. Lynn, would you like to do that?
Happy to. Great panel, by the way. I think you find that when folks set up, you've touched on it a little bit, when families set up trusts, in some ways, are they doing it for them or to them? And the beneficiaries are receiving these trusts. Are they prepared for it? Do they understand how this will change their relationship with their family? And you have this family office that manages this array of trusts for multiple generations. And the beneficiaries, in some cases, feel controlled. Their life is controlled by this trust. A lot of unintended experiences there. And I'm curious, just the nature of trusts and how they sort of play into the dynamics of how families work together.
That's a really great question. If I may, I'll speak a little to that. I think that in law, managing expectations is huge. And so if a family is creating a vehicle that's going to impact someone else and that person's going to be surprised by it, that's not a good plan. It reminds me of the old joke where they're reading the will and they said, and to Billy, who I promised to remember in my will, hi, Billy. And that's it, right? So the question is, what are you doing that will support the beneficiary? And what are the theories behind what you're doing? And those are I think those are great discussions to have during one's life, not in the document. Like, my goal is to give you support where needed, but not to suppress your entrepreneurial desires. I don't want to replace your income. I want to supplement it. And as long as you're doing positive things in life, then this is something that you can use, but not to be a crutch. You certainly don't want to remove the desire to succeed, because we've all seen infantilized beneficiaries because they didn't have to do anything. If you haven't seen the movie Born Rich, I commend it to you. It's done by Jamie Johnson from the Johnson Wax family. And periodically it shows up on Netflix. I don't know why it comes and goes, but it's the word indolent comes up a lot because these are kids who really had no reason for being. I mean, in contrast to the family of the pioneer days where you had kids, so you have someone to work the field. They had a very specific purpose in mind. But these kids, they don't have to do anything. And if you don't think that money can breed indolence, try to hire a babysitter in a wealthy area for under $30 an hour plus healthcare. It's just it's very, very corrosive if it's not done right. So not discussing it, and I'm sure Efi and Ken have got experiences. I know they have, but I won't speak for them with that issue.
Oh, Efi, anything you can add on that?
Yeah, I'll add that transparency solves many ills. And so, I always urge for more transparency with families and across generations, because I think what you find is, 5 generations later, somebody's looking to, read a trust document or figure out what was intended, decades ago, and the world has changed 500 times since then. The family has evolved, and what was intended back then, if the person was alive today, would not be what they meant, if you're trying to sort of figure out what's being said in a document. So, it's nuanced, it evolves. It's all documents really have to be sort of living, breathing things. And again, it's just a document. So whatever you can, build into, the family mission and the Constitution, all those sort of other part, the family meetings, the annual family meetings, everything that you can do to build sort of a sustainable framework beyond just, the financial aspect is beneficial.
And I think, Efi, when also the trying to anticipate the future is so difficult, especially when the person they're asking to anticipate the future is somebody who's working their ass off at a very large company that they've spent a lifetime on. Do they want to spend months trying to figure out, well, what's the best way to what are the parameters that I should set forth so that I don't destroy my children's upbringing, and their children. And so to try to set that all, to figure out, is somebody going to be a drug addict, or is somebody going to be, someone that doesn't care about their own children and will squander the money that's given to them. Those are all tough questions, and you're asking it of someone usually that everybody waits until for a long time before they ever get around to being serious about saying, do I want to say, maybe I have a child that college is not the right choice for them. And but do I, if somebody is a violinist, do you say, hey, you achieve these things and you get this if you the standard corporate family office kind of education, get your MBA so you can help me manage this money. And there's lists of things I've personally helped people that said, hey, look, just go to yoga 3 times a week. Actually certain lifestyle things that they think will help them just be enjoy their life or be a decent person. Because I think that's what most people are really after.
Yeah. And if I may add to that, the lawyers like to use phrases like the law of unintended consequences, where a family says, I'll match whatever my kids earn. And you've got his daughter's a hedge fund manager and his son teaches an inner city school. So the son gets an extra $500 million a year and the teacher gets another 70,000. It can be horrible. So I think that what some people call a living will or a letter of wishes, where there's a discussion of the philosophy of the money. And for some, it's that, well, where I'm in, grandpa made a lot of money and I'm the steward through my life. My goal is to keep it as as great a wealth as it is and maybe grow it and have it be beneficial to my children and pass it on and on and on. There are others who say, I have no clue who my great-great-grandfather was, so I don't expect my great-great-grandchildren to know much about me either or really care. So I want to have it go to the next and the next and maybe the third generation and then distribute to the foundation. But again, these are not right or wrong questions. There are answers. They're really, what is it the family believes philosophically? Because like Ken points out with education, we aren't far from seeing education as we know it disappear. The Ivy League, even a building, we certainly can envision school being almost the equivalent of putting electrodes on your ears and going to sleep and learning Latin while you're, there's so many things that can come up the way education is done now with the Zoom and the like. So it used to be you would give a kid, if the kid went to an accredited school, or you give the equivalent of 4 years tuition at Harvard. But those benchmarks could easily disappear. So you need to start with the premise is, what am I trying to accomplish for them? And it's the same thing with medical. Well, I'll pay for anything that the insurance company covers. That doesn't necessarily work because insurance companies are for profit. They're not really necessarily, if you're the patriarch, you may say, I want a procedure that's not covered by the insurance company. It's going to keep me alive. I don't want to not get that because it's not on their list of approved procedures. So I think having the philosophy can be very helpful.
One thing too is oftentimes we get so focused on managing these assets, managing the businesses, managing the things, that we lose sight that for most families, those things are not the most important. It's actually the relationships that they have. And so as leaders of a family office, as service providers to a family office, I think pausing enough to say, okay, in what ways is this structure, are these structures serving the people? I think it brings it all back into proper context. And sometimes we can get so focused on the performance of an asset that we stop, that we don't take time to look at how the humans are being served by what was created. And to me, the answer to all of this is humanize the process, humanize all of it, and continue to look into and question, is this serving the people it was intended to serve? And if it is, great. And if it's not, then what needs to change in terms of systems, processes, who's inside, who's outsourced? That's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but I think most of these offices get organized to manage assets, but ultimately they're designed to serve people. And so if we can always return to the people part of it, I think we can discover how that office needs to evolve to serve those people, because you have people joining the family that need to be onboarded. You have people that are leaving the family. And all of those transitions are really challenging, and many of them are not planned for. So maybe we could dive into that onboarding process. And as you think about onboarding family members, so someone's marrying into the family where there is a family office. Efi, I'll start with you. What are some of the best practices for, I guess, establishing that relationship and understanding of what the relationship should be with this new family member and the family office? What have you seen families do to proactively onboard, in-laws, to get them up to speed so that this thing that's created over here actually has a positive impact on the new relationship and not a detrimental, effect?
Well, in-laws are dicey. I'll tell you that. In-laws can be very dicey for families. I've seen it many ways, and it's across the spectrum on how families handle this. Some are more sort of a closed system and don't like to include in-laws, but I go back to my comment about transparency. I mean, these are, people who are eventually going to have, create more generations of the family. And anything that sets, people against other people in the same ecosystem eventually, breeds sort of bad blood. It can breed bad blood. So, I go back to, before it happens, right? Or at the first time you have a transition event like this, establish a protocol, establish a process, establish, how are we going to, anticipate this going forward? And if there's a hiccup the first time, you can address and, overcome and come up with sort of a better solution for the next one. So again, things are going to happen, things unexpected, divorce, death, there's all kinds of change in a family that is going to happen no matter what, right? Just by the grace of time. So I think the more adaptive and resilient and, again, build it in so that when it happens, you're constantly evolving with it.
Tim, what would you add?
Well, I think the managing expectations phrase comes up again here. I think it's, as Efi points out, it's a minefield. It's sort of like when your child comes to you and says, I'm getting married, and you say prenup. I mean, if the first thing you say, it sounds like, I don't trust your choice. I don't like who you have as an option. But it's not unusual, certainly among the generation, the greatest generation, the people who were born in the early 1900s to the mid 1900s, to think it's a bloodline thing. Sorry, it's a bloodline. So my kids, not their spouses, will be the owners. And it wasn't unusual to see trusts set up that money went from the parent to the child to the grandchild, and the child died, and the daughter-in-law or son-in-law was left penniless, because the money went to their kids. They didn't give anything. They didn't give any thought to what should the daughter-in-law or son-in-law have. The mechanics of this are very simple. A prenup is just between the two who are married, and the parents who say they have to have a prenup have no way of knowing if it was torn up the wedding night. It's not filed anywhere. There's it's not like you can't cancel it without permission. So you need to have agreements with who can be a permissible shareholder. You have a shareholders agreement as to who's the owner, but you still have to build in something so that the in-laws have money to live on if still, obviously, they're the parents of the grandchildren. So you want to provide for them, but is it realistic to give them a vote in the business? And that's going to depend a lot upon the business. It's very different to say, I want my daughter-in-law to be the part of my water valve business. It has to really understand the whole international structure of my business as to saying there's money being distributed. Does my daughter-in-law have a say in where it goes, right? So it's almost like having classes of stock, but it becomes dicey if you saying, well, my son and daughter's spouses are in, but my second son's wife, should not be in. She's just not good at that kind of thing. You're really setting up for failure at that point. You have to rethink that. I don't think you can treat people too disparately. But I know, Ken, you've seen this before in the families you've worked with. What do you say about it?
Well, I think you can also you can't do everything, but you can make some adjustments to make some protection. So the daughter that's living next to mom in the $40 million house wants the $20 million. The mom wants the daughter to have the $20 million house in the neighborhood. So, and yet they didn't do the prenup. And so one way to accomplish that is to, borrow the money again, not against the house initially. You borrow it against, some amount of liquid assets, and then buy the house with those proceeds when you end up having a mortgage on the house, so that if their marriage lasts for 2 years, there's not some great windfall for the other spouse. And there's ways to do that without it being annoyingly obvious. But I think your discussion, Tim, of being able to treat everybody the same, as long as everybody in the family is the same, eventually, no matter how much wealth you have, your children measure you by how much milk you poured in their glass when they were 3, so unknowingly. So, but I do think there are ways to protect and just try not to do it in an obnoxious manner.
So I realize we've gone just over an hour. I feel like I've hogged the experts here with my questions, and so I want to open it up for our audience. If any of you would like to ask a question, feel free to take yourself off of mute, and or you can raise your hand, and I can call on you. If there are any questions, I'd love to hear from you. Jay, looks like you have a question. Go ahead.
Well, just for fun, on the last point about married-ins, the question I asked the family, as we're talking about it for the moment, the client family, is why would the married-in choose us? That's the question I asked them. Rather than, oh dear, it's just dangerous, we're in trouble. Because actually, the married-ins are the only people who choose this family. Nobody else. Everybody else is in by biology, DNA, however you want to define it. It's involuntary and have to decide if they want to stay. But the thing that's fascinated me about the married-ins over the years is that they're the only ones who choose the family. So they're in a voluntary position. And why would they choose us is, I think, the right question. Isn't that interesting? It's a liberating question. And it isn't almost never asked. That's the only reason for jumping in, Dave, that my experience has been that's the one liberating question. Why would they choose us? Because they could ask our family member to choose them. Uh-oh, now we've lost assets. Now we're in trouble. But so isn't the question, are we positively attracting to them? Not are we positively negative to them? I think this is a really, really interesting question. Why would they choose us? Wow, I can tell you that opens up the conversation that I think people actually want to have. So that's the only reason for jumping in. It is a question. It's also sort of an experience. So thanks.
Definitely something to ponder. Thank you, Jay. Other questions from the audience? I'd love to hear from a couple of you. Steffi, go ahead and take yourself off mute. Thank you, Steffi.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So panel, the human relationships seem to be the underpinnings of so much. How do you deal? I mean, Efi, I realize that you come in to help with these things. So your answer is going to be different than from Tim and Ken. And I'll be interested in hearing all three of you. But what do you do, Tim and Ken? But how you're in the middle of all this. And Ken, I know some stories about how in the middle of you've been with a lot of things. So how far do you personally go, the two of you, before you bring in someone else? And then for you, Efi, where do you start when you walk in and, wow, this is.
Just to clarify the question, are you talking specifically about family dynamics? How far do Ken and Tim go outside of the law or outside of the accounting space? Is that what you mean?
Yes, when
Okay.
the family dynamics, correct.
So where do those services start and stop for each of you is the question.
Yeah.
Ken, why don't you go first?
Well, I think you know, a lot of times I think all three of us do things that are not in our field, and not that you're and you certainly don't want to do something you're not competent in, but you're eventually going to push whoever is involved to the right kind of experts. And so how far do you go? And I just have one quick story of a family that a very wealthy family that had a kid that ended up he was addicted to narcotics, and it actually had died twice and was brought back with Narcan, and was still an addict, a brilliant guy with an MBA, and I was at some event with the dad and this son, And I sat next to the son. The dad was on the other side of the table, and I just had this great conversation with him. I didn't really know him, except, you know, you knew that he had an amazing love for his dad that was genuine and not monetarily based. And the next morning, I went into the dad and said, "Hey, you know, do you mind if I, you know, talk to him about rehab and about get back?" He says, "Hey, look, we've done rehab 4 or 5 times. He just can't be helped. He took drugs yesterday. He'll take them today. You know, there's nothing you can do." And I said, "Yeah, but do you mind if I try?" And he said, "You do what you want." And I went to a really great friend who was an expert and had him go talk to my friend. And that guy now, he ended up getting clean with a great facility because he wanted the outdoors. You know, he wanted some outdoor experience, and this was a outdoor kind of place that he went to out of state. And it really helped. Well, so where he is today, so he got clean, and where he is today is he went back and got a master's degree in psychology, and is, you know, helping people similarly situated to him. So, you know, I think sometimes you may not have the expertise, but I think the 3 of us know an awful lot of people that are awfully good at other things. And you need to, but before you can find those people, you don't even know who to look for until you have that conversation. And sometimes it's an uncomfortable conversation because, you know, it's not your field of expertise.
I would just add, you know, it may not be your field of expertise, but care, you know, caring about someone and loving them and wanting to help is the best place to start. And we shouldn't go beyond our expertise, but as you talked about, Ken, I mean, you cared and you wanted to help that person, and because of that, you know, maybe it was a connection that you had that helped them. It wasn't necessarily your specific expertise in helping them with that specific issue, but I think as professionals, you know, having genuine care about the people that we're serving is the right place to start. Tim, anything else to add on
Yeah,
there?
I would say that when you're dealing with family offices, again, the closest analogy is just dealing with an estate plan. Everything matters. And so for many times you'll find people who do estate planning, and for $1,800, they'll do a living trust or whatever. It's not hard to do those. And it's not like the difference between right and wrong necessarily. It's a difference between doing something that actually makes sense in light of your wishes and needs. So it's vitally important for me to know how my families are interacting. Are they accurate in their reporting? Maybe sometimes. It wouldn't be the first time a patriarch or matriarch said, "I want to give more power to the next generation," and have no intention whatsoever of giving power to the next generation. I want to give more information. I want to be more transparent. No, they don't. But that's fine because they get to do that. The challenge is when they talk about what they're doing to their children and set expectations, and then they don't do that. I mean, I had a family where the son worked for 40 years for the father, and basically, instead of getting much of a salary, he would get interest in deals that the dad was doing. So at the end of 40 years, he had a pretty nice net worth, and assumed that when the father passed away, the estate plan would provide 50-50 of what was left between the daughter and the son. Well, for some reason, the father changed his estate plan at the end of his life to give the daughter more than 50-50. So he was equalizing up, basically saying, well, everything you did for the last 40 years, I'm not paying for. The son was devastated. You see that. It's a very challenging situation, but there are answers. When you have a family business and 1 or 2 or 3 of the kids are in it and 1, 2 or 3 are not in it, but it gets back to disclosure and pointing out to the family that part of what you're doing is not going to be workable. Where I have a family where the daughter and the son really never spoke, and the father wanted to leave equal shares to both of them. And when it's in the final analysis, I think he felt, you two have been so annoying to me my whole life, the way you fight. I'm going to just give you half each and you can sort it out. And if there's anything left after your lawsuits, you can spend that. So it was sort of his last hurrah. Is we actually talked about, you could sell your business now and divide up the money, be very efficient. No, I'd rather let them fight it out. I mean, that was a conscious decision.
Those are painful ones.
Yeah.
Efi, what would you add? Anything else to, I guess, just where you start and stop in terms of the work you do, and how do we stay in our lanes, but also get families what they need?
Well, I'll say I do feel like a therapist sometimes, without the degree, but I think, all generations respond to an advisor who listens well. People want to be heard, and that's the bottom line in any line of work. And the nature of a family office, the very framework of a family office is to constantly examine and re-examine yourself. And so, look under the hood, take a 360-degree, diagnostic review of how the family office is performing. And I don't mean the investment performance, but really how is the family being served holistically? And sometimes people don't want to step aside. Often people, either the elder statesmen of the family or certain family members or longstanding outside advisors, they don't want to step aside. They may have great institutional knowledge, but may not be great stewards for the family. And so again, just kind of, take a good look, constantly examine that and ask the hard questions.
I like your phrase institutional knowledge, because many times the in-house or long-term advisors are nervous about us coming in. We don't want to replace them. We want to help backstop them because they know so much about how it's worked in the past, and it can be very, very valuable. But again, I think that unless you've done a lot of this work, you don't really know the options available to the client. And when the client sees those options, sometimes they're surprised that they actually have options they never thought about before.
Very good. I see Amber with her little virtual hand up, so we're going to call on Amber.
Oh.
What question do you have, Amber?
Hi, yeah, this panel's been really helpful. So I'm pretty new to the single family office space. I've been at it for 2 months.
That's new.
Very new. I spent 8 years working in the multifamily office space.
Okay.
And a client in the multifamily office space wanted to create a single family office and hired me. So we're both just getting started. And I'm so mindful that the decisions we're making now in this first year are going to set the tone, and that, you only get one shot to get this started right. So I would love to hear from the group, what would you say at the beginning? What's the thing that you can't undo that, you wish, okay, if we could go back and start fresh, what advice there at the beginning is most important?
Efi, do you want to start?
Oh, that's a tough one. What can't you undo? I mean, I usually tell clients, because especially in the tax world, that I came from, clients were always worried about giving away too much, right? We were always pushing them to do more planning. And they were always worried, well, I'm not going to control it anymore. And what if I run out of money, which of course they never do, And my answer was always, there's always a solution, right? We come to every stage and we'll always find a solution. It can't be that there's no solution. And there's a range of solutions, and maybe some are better than others, and maybe it's not, ideal. There's a spectrum between, you can't eliminate every risk, right? So I guess my answer to that is, I don't know if there's like one absolute must do, especially every family office is different, every family is different, and it's hard to know what might be right for one and not another. But I think you're doing right just by asking the question, right? What should I be looking at? What should I be examining? Who should I be talking to? What kind of capabilities do I have in-house? And, what are the things that I don't even realize I'm not asking yet? So just being really, inquisitive and sharp and all those things will help. But I don't know that there's one thing that, oh my God, if I do this, I can't undo it.
Amber, one thing I would say is if you can do the work to define the purpose for which you've become a single family office, if that becomes really clear, and now that's going to change and it's going to evolve as the family changes and evolves, but if you can get really clear on that purpose, then I think that that will lead you to decide what comes in-house, what you outsource, where you spend your energy and your time. And I think always returning to that purpose, the original purpose, and saying, has the purpose changed? And if it has, how do we need to react? How do we need to change the service offering? I think that's the safest place to start, is begin with the purpose, because if you have a clear purpose, then you'll know how to solve for that purpose. But if you don't, you're going to be guessing at service offerings and what, we're going to die a death of 1,000 shoulds, and that's never a good place to be.
Dave, that's really great advice. And I would just add one thing to it is, I think you want to know more about that family than they do. So, and as you care about that, and today it's so much easier because there are great systems everywhere. And if you use, the right systems and you accumulate a body of knowledge, I guarantee you're going to know twice as much as the family knows about their own facts. And once you get to that point, then you know whether to call Efi or Tim about some particular issue or something. But you have to dominate the information. I used to have an entity book that I created for a family, but we had 600 entities, and how could you possibly know? I mean, this was before they had enormous systems that are great today, and so it's much easier today. But I just had one page. So if you have one page on an entity, who are the lawyers? Who are the accountants? Who are the other advisors? And then for trusts, the same kinds of things. But today, you pick the right systems and use those to put yourself in a position to give great advice.
Yeah.
Amber, has that been helpful?
Yes, in many ways. The purpose right now is still the founder's purpose, and I want to learn more about the kids' purpose. And that there are many systems, but nothing's better than Excel. And in terms of being organized, so that's so helpful. Thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you for your question.
I wanted to add, if I may, to that, and that, Amber, is that I'm going to give you a definitive answer. What to do first? It's not going to be, it depends. The first thing to do is lunch. By that I mean, you need to sit down with the people you're considering as advisors in a lunch and get to know each other, because people are generally not always that insightful as to what they really want. They want, sometimes will say what they think you want to hear, but not really what they want. And so just ask the hard questions. You have to ask the hard questions like, well, do you really want to give your money equally to your kids? And many people don't. They think, I don't want to give more than X dollars to my kids. I want to put the rest in the foundation. I just feel guilty about it. Maybe I got money from my parents and they were very generous, but I think it actually was a de-incentivizer for myself. So I want to do something different. But that's where I'd start, is a conversation. And as Ken says, that kind of information is critical. I was working recently with a family where they had all these entities, and I finally found out why they had them, because the matriarch did the books, and she just found it easier to start a new entity and have a checkbook for that entity to keep track of things like budget. I mean, it was a Byzantine structure that no one had ever looked at, but it was easier for her in her mind to keep books that way. So you have to question those things. So like, why is this done? And you'll undoubtedly find things that really don't make sense anymore.
Well, and oftentimes you also see these structures created because, well, my peer has a single family office, and so that must mean that I need a single family office, right, which is crazy to think about. But Amber, thanks so much. And I'm sure if you can spend some time individually with any of the panelists, I would encourage that. We have another question in the chat, and Stacy, I'd love for you to just come on if you're available to do that and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you. This has been such a wonderful discussion. So my question is down the timeline from Amber's question, and it's looking at transitions, and that's such a delicate time. And so I would love to hear any of the exemplar stories. We have plenty of stories of, suboptimal transitions, but would love to hear any of the exemplary stories of transition, either from the founder's office going into the family in G2 or G2 to G3. So any insights? Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
Sure. I'm happy to speak to that because we've had a number, and I think the more structure that people have knowingly created, the more likely it is to be successful. And so that it's actually clearly defined as to how the office is going to work, but it's been done in an organic way so that the family has a structure that works for them and people understand. But it's also works because the kids understand what they can and can't rely upon. It's not unusual for parents to tell kids, someday this will all be yours, but they may not have actually done that in their estate plan. I never tell. My dad used to say, you don't want to get undressed too early for bed. You don't want to give away too much before. But then you got other people who say, I don't want an estate plan until it's time, as if somehow you get a 30-day notice from death that you've got to get ready all of a sudden. So there's this tension there between promises and expectations, which have to be in alignment or the kids are going to be upset, and making sure that the parents' philosophy of the money has been communicated well to the kids. So that's in alignment with their expectation. If you're talking about a financial office primarily, where it's just money, it's a much simpler issue because you can hire most of what you need. But best have been ones where they pick a trusted advisor. That's when I met Ken, was running as a trusted advisor for Marvin Davis. He intimately knew the children and the grandchildren and wouldn't just take orders from Marvin, had the ability to talk to him knowingly about what would be good for this kid or that kid. That's hugely important, to have people who really know the family. It's like a therapist who's asked by a patient to diagnose the patient's friend. That's pretty tough. You really want the advisor to have intimate knowledge of the people. So I think in those cases, it transfers very well because they have a good structure and good expectation. But what have you seen, Ken and Efi?
I was just going to add that 99% of successful transitions happen long before the transition itself, right? Either the transition is temporary and, something happens suddenly, or it's a death that is going to come sometime in the future, something like that. But 99% of the way to have those be really successful is to plan early and often. And, too often, like succession planning is an agenda item on the agenda at the very bottom, and it just keeps getting rolled over to the next agenda and nobody's ever really focusing on it. So just planning early and often for every kind of transition. And again, the ones that are just temporary and suddenly disruptive, but will, sort of self-correct, and the longer, obvious ones.
I also would like to say, I think we don't run enough simulations. So we should run simulations regularly. Let's simulate, a passing of someone. Let's simulate a divorce of someone. Let's simulate other life events. And as we run through those simulations, then we find out, how well is this structure going to serve the people that are left behind? And we don't have to wait for a death. We can have a simulation, and as an advisor, we can run those and ask those humans how this works. What questions are unanswered for you? And I don't think we do that enough. So that's my 2 cents. Stacy, anything else you'd add, Ken?
Yeah, Dave, I think if you simulate divorces, you might get into a little trouble in a family office. But I actually, just as an advisor to a family office, came in and instantly recognized that those two people were not going to be together. I mean, I know that it's sort of arrogant to say that, but I think for all of us, if you see hundreds of situations, you probably have a little tiny better chance of recognizing something. and they had a whole bunch of kids and $1 billion+ and the principal just, I brought it up and he just wanted to kill me, because he just said that there's just no possible way and this, that. And I said, well, just show me your prenup. He said, oh, there is no prenup. And so I went and I finally talked him into a prenup and we did it in a way which, was very generous. It wasn't like a confiscatory prenup and got it accomplished. And 3 years later, he was divorced. But, I guarantee you the prenup didn't cost him over $500 million. So it was relatively modest compared to the amount of money that was involved. And more importantly, is the non-monetary issues that are sometimes contained in those prenups when you have children.
So we are right up against it right now. But one other thing I would say is on those simulations, let me clarify there. I think we should simulate when a family office executive leaves. There are very few that are doing a good job with succession planning with family offices. We talk about it all day, every day with family businesses, but there's very little succession planning that's taking place with family office leaders and executives. And it is hugely dangerous because you look at these family offices and there's few people with lots of information, and also there's sometimes there's a lack of systems. There's a lack of kind of reporting or dual knowledge of similar issues and how decisions are made. And so we should probably spend another hour on succession planning with family offices, but that's for another day. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank each of you for investing your time, which is your treasure, as my good friend Jay would say. And I would encourage each of you to reach out individually, whether it's to me at the Drucker School or Tim or Ken or Efi, if you have questions. And I know you probably do. There's questions that are appropriate to ask in front of a public audience, and there's a lot of other questions that you'd rather not ask. So I will share contact information for Efi, Ken, and Tim. And again, thank you so much for investing your time with us today, and really appreciate you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.